Hi, I'm Clark Dunlap, and we are taking a look at the book of Numbers for our Sunday morning community groups. It's an interesting study in a different time and a different group of people, but God has things to say to us through what He said to them. Now, one of the purposes I'm doing this is to encourage our teachers to be able to find points that they may have missed or applications they may have missed as they first read through the passage. And I hope you've read through the passage already, but I'm not going to hit all of them, but I'm going to suggest a few, and feel free to use those as a springboard and bring up other things. I once heard a Bible teacher that I really like to listen to say, when you're preaching a certain passage, look for the drama. Now, the drama may not be the most important point of the story or the passage, but it's often a great springboard. It's a way to increase people's interest, and it may find that the tension in the passage that God resolves with His wisdom or by His deeds. And so there's a lot of drama in this passage in Numbers chapter 11 today. In fact, we have some riffraff, we have some Israelites, we even have Moses acting like what we sometimes call a drama queen, okay? Well, looking at Numbers chapter 11, starting in verse 4, we kind of have three acts in this. We have Act 1, the complainers, okay? Then we go to Act 2, the angry leader. And then in Act 3, the gracious God. I'm glad that many stories in the Bible end up with the gracious God. Now, you might ask your class, have they ever started to do something, maybe to fix something, to work on the car, to fix something in the house? Maybe they're even cooking a meal, and only to realize they're missing something, maybe an important tool, maybe an important ingredient, but they are missing something. They're not equipped to finish the job. You might ask somebody to share an example of what they've experienced that helps everybody understand that kind of frustration. Just the other day, I had to go to the store. I had a list of things to buy, a little grocery list. Now, they weren't all groceries. I had to get things from all over the store. And I finally collected all. It's just 8 or 9 items, but it was rather eclectic bunch of things that I had. And as I got to the checkout, I scanned all my items. I am ready to pay for it. I reach for my wallet, and my wallet's not in my pocket. And after a moment of panic, I suddenly remembered I had just gotten my oil changed in the car. And it was one of those places where you sit in the car while they do it. And the fella came to the window. I pulled out my wallet, gave him my card, and when he brought the card back to me, I just laid my wallet on the seat and totally forgot about it. I didn't have the most important tool to finish this job of grocery shopping that I needed to have. Fortunately, God equips those that He calls. Ephesians 4:11 says He gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, and shepherds and teachers to equip the saints. To equip the saints for ministry, in fact. And I think anything we do for others can fall under that category of ministry. Teachers minister. Nurses, moms, dads, friends can minister. And all of us need to be equipped for our calling. Now, before we start reading chapter 11, let's set the stage with what happened in chapter 10. But first, chapter 9. You remember chapter 9? We learned all about the glory of God in the cloud and the fire, and how God was going to lead them, and how at the very beginning Israel is totally ready to obey. Then in chapter 10, we see after a year or so that they were camped at Mount Sinai, the cloud lifts up and the people begin to travel. And they traveled for 3 days to a place called the wilderness of Paran. It's an area that's south west of the Dead Sea, kind of due south of central Israel. And so now in chapter 11, we find ourselves there. And we'll read from verse 4. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up. There is nothing at all but this manna to look at." Now the manna was like a coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it, and ground it in hand mills, or beat it with mortars, and boiled it in pots, and made cakes. Some translations say pastries of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of pastries baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. I suppose you all remember the whole thing about how manna stayed with them from the beginning of their journey all the way till they got to the promised land. Well, this Act 1 is the complainers. And I like the description he uses in verse 4, the rabble. The King James Version calls it a mixed multitude. So there was a lot of people, and somehow they were mixed. Well, other translations use troublemakers or riffraff. These were likely non-Jewish people who had left Egypt with the Israelites. They were somehow unwanted and forced out when Israel left. Or perhaps it was a mixture of non-Jews and Jews, and a good group of them. Anyway, a certain group started all this drama, complaining about what they were eating every day. And it says they had a strong craving. In fact, that text could be translated, they were craving a craving. That's a pretty intense craving right there. Now, I've known somebody who carried my children, my wife, and I remember some of her cravings years and years ago. Some of those were intense. I don't think that compared, okay, with the kind of craving they were having here. They were almost manic about this. And then it looks like a whole large group of Israelites followed their lead and started crying about this craving. Is anybody going to give us some meat? The first mistake seems to be this craving of something that God has not provided for them. Ever done that? You might ask the class, is there something you've ever really, really wanted and God hadn't provided it? You're not sure God wants you to have it. It may seem like a good thing, but you want it so badly. And then they show how bad their memories were. In verse 5, they say, we remember these free fish. Free? They were slaves. They didn't have money or bank accounts. They probably didn't have their own chariot to ride, much less a horse. And also, they didn't have freedom. And they worked hard for everything, and it seems like sometimes they got paid in fish, or maybe had just enough time not working to catch some fish. But when they say there was free fish, they have selective memory going on here, because there were some horrible things about bondage in Egypt. And then they say our strength is dried up. And very possibly it was a reference to their appetites. They've lost their appetite. And they had been living on manna for a little while here. They were able to walk for 3 days. They weren't without basic strength. I think they're just really tired of the manna. So when I say they had bad memories, there was selective memory. They were remembering the parts they wanted to. They were thinking that life was so much better back in Egypt because fish. Now, nothing about their taskmasters was mentioned. Nothing mentioned about the brutality of life, about making bricks without straw. They were the good old days. They got to eat fish in Egypt. They also had a selective memory about the manna. They were making cakes that tasted like pastries cooked with fine oil. Okay, I might get a little tired of eating pastries every meal. But weeping at the entrance to my house, that's some serious drama right there. So now let's look at this frustrated leader. Look down to verse 10. We're going to read a few verses here, 10 to 15. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give to their fathers? Where am I going to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I'm not able to carry this people all alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me now. If I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness." Moses is upset, obviously. Before we get to Moses, the first thing we learn here is that God is angry. The Lord blazed hotly. In the text, in the Hebrew, it suggests there was this burning in his nose. He was breathing out heat and anger. And it's a picture here. Now, you might ask the class, why do you think God is so angry? We know that in our student booklet that your students may have, it talks about this on page 23. And you might have them look there if they need some help with this. But let me suggest a few things to throw into the discussion about why was God angry. Very first, they simply were not grateful. God had provided a way for them to eat every day without sowing crops. They were going to be a nomadic people for a season. They couldn't grow crops and eat from their own labor. And God is providing a way. They can't kill enough game to feed like over 2 million people. That would be an incredible burden. God is supplying manna every day for them. And I would be very surprised that that manna did not have everything in it that a human diet would need. I think it would probably be a great thing to have, to be able to fall back on. And I know I could eat this little pastry and get all the nutrients that I need. They showed no gratitude for that. Let me tell you something. Thanksgiving is important to God. God tells us when we make our request known to Him, we should do it with thanksgiving. In Romans chapter 1, when God describes how people degenerate down into wickedness, one of the first things that the book of Romans says about people is that they know there is a God, they're not thankful. Gratitude is important. Secondly, they complained against God's mercy. They had already fallen in sin before this, when they were camped at Mount Sinai, after their exodus from Egypt. You remember Moses goes up on the mountain. He spends a long time up there. They're thinking, we don't know what happened to Moses. They say to Aaron, make us some gods to take us to the promised land. And so next thing you know, they're making golden calves. They're worshiping idols. One of the top 10 commandments, right, is thou shalt have no other God before me. They're violating this right at the foot of the mountain that God is giving them the law. And sure enough, God was angry. And God was about to wipe them all out and use Moses as the progenitor of a great nation. And Moses prayed for them. And so some of them fell by the sword of the Levites. Some of them died in a plague, but God had spared the rest of them. They were already subjects of God's mercy here. and yet they're complaining in spite of the mercy of God. Weeping over food. They had food to eat, but weeping over the menu. They also misrepresented God's goodness. God was giving them actual free food. And they say, well, our appetite is gone in verse 6. So there's several things here that I think, and there's probably other things that I can't even imagine that God knows, that he was angry. But not only was God angry, Moses was very upset. But in a different way, I want you to think about the drama of Moses here. He says to God, why have you brought such trouble on me? Now, when I read this, I think, now God's going to be mad at Moses. Moses knew what the deal was from the burning bush. I'm going to send you back to the people. You're going to lead them out of captivity, and you're going to be the leader of this nation. So this wasn't a new thing, but he's acting like God has just given him more than he can handle. In verse 12, he said, did I conceive all these people? Are they my babies that I should carry them to the promised land? That's really a little humorous there, but you can see the complaint in his tone. These aren't my babies. I shouldn't have to do this. And in verse 13, it's like, and for crying out loud, where am I going to find meat? Well, Israel was crying out loud. And now it sounds like Moses is, because he doesn't know how he's going to find meat to feed over 2 million people. And finally, in verse 14, I think we get to the heart of the problem. I can't carry all these people by myself. That, I think, is the heart of Moses' cry. I can't do this. Moses is upset with God, but he finally admits his inadequacy. I can't do this. Now, you might ask the class, have you ever gone to God and say, it's all too much? It's just more than I can deal with. Have you ever poured out your heart to God like that? Sometimes when you ask these questions, you have to sit there very silently for several seconds to give them a chance to frame their words and answer your question. The next thing I would think is, did you live to tell about it? Did you survive that? If someone has a story, allow them to share it. But we probably have all been there at some time that it's just all too much. But that brings us to the third act. What did God graciously do at this point? I mentioned earlier that God equips the called. And I've noticed that God often does not call the equipped. Think about that. I was not equipped at all when I began to sense God's call on me. I remember as a young man, my mother saying to me about ministry, if you can do anything else, do that. Now that sounds a little discouraging, but I knew her heart. And she was saying, make sure this is God calling and not your imagination. And I had to do that over time, largely because I did not seem to be equipped to pastor God's people. My story is not unique. You know, when God called Moses at the burning bush, Moses argued with God because he was saying, I'm not equipped for this job. I can't do this. And I would think Moses had complained to God so much that God was angry with him too. But what does God do? Look at verse 16 and 17. The Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand with you. And I will come down and talk with you there. And I will take some of the spirit that's on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of this people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone. You know, when God says, gather 70 men to stand with you at the tent of meeting, which refers to the tabernacle, that's kind of interesting. I might have thought, is God going to punish them all? And he says in verse 17, I will come and talk with you. This is grace. God choosing to communicate with us is just grace. God sent Jesus, the Word of God. The Word means God is communicating to us through Jesus. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Communicating with us is grace. And God hearing the prayer that you have prayed and not judging you is grace, especially if you ever prayed like Moses just did. That's grace. And he says, I will take some of the Spirit on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden with you. You know, I don't think that God is diminishing the gifts he gave, or the Spirit that he gave to Moses. He's going to share what he gave Moses with 70 other men. And I think at this point, Moses being reminded what a great, gracious God he serves. God was just sharing what Moses had with 70 others. Imagine this. He's been all alone leading this people. 70 other men to be among the most humble who ever lived. That was one of the leading characteristics of Moses, his humility. Now there's 70 other men with the spirit of humility. 70 other men with leadership skills that encourage people to follow them. 70 other men who shared Moses' unshakable faith in God. 70 other men to bear the burden of carrying Israel, God's people, where they don't know how to go. This is a gracious God. Heard the prayer. You heard the cry of Moses, I can't do this. And God is saying, I'm gifting you. I've given you skills. I've given you my Spirit. And now I'm going to give you 70 men to walk beside you, to help you to bear this burden. You might ask your class, can you trust God to give you exactly what you need? And you trust God for the equipment, the right tools to minister in the way that He opens the door for. And what things do you need to thank Him for that He has already done for you? I hope you enjoy teaching this lesson this coming Sunday.